Hello, and welcome to another episode of South Pole, the podcast that explores everything Antarctica. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and today we are talking about Antarctic women, place names, plastic, cleanups, maps, and interdisciplinary activism with guest Carol Devine. All right. Hello, everyone. It is lovely to have you here. Before we jump into it today, I have to tell you that this is the season finale of South Pole. We covered quite a lot in season 2, from ice cores to food webs, sustainable krill fishing, permafrost, and the first explorer to fly across the continent. And I'm glad you made it here with us to the end. But this is not the end. We will be back with season 3 and 10 more interdisciplinary episodes of Antarctic stories and Antarctic science in just a handful of weeks. And today we are ending with a big finish. We are joined today by Carol Devine, a researcher and writer who has worked on the intersection of global health, environmental issues, and polar exploration. Carol has led a number of projects that emphasize the connection between human well-being and planetary health, particularly in the polar regions, and we are going to talk about 2 of them today. First, we'll explore the Antarctic Cleanup Project, where Carol and a team of volunteers collaborated with the research stations to remove waste left in Antarctica, while also raising awareness about environmental protocols set by the Antarctic Treaty. Then we'll shift to her project, Mapping Antarctic Women, which highlights the contributions of women in Antarctica by tracing the place names across the continent that honor their legacies, bringing to light the told and untold stories of women's role in polar history. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I really enjoyed my chat with Carol. I'll say up front that the projects we talk about today are linked in the show notes so that anytime during the episode you're curious about them, you can find more about them there. And while you're there, you might consider giving us a 1-tap 5-star review so that more people can learn about these projects too. All right, let's dive in. Okay, we are recording. Welcome to the show. The first question I have is if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your research.
My name is Carol Devine. I'm based in Toronto, Canada, and I'm really lucky because I've been able to do research on Antarctica, on planetary health, on humanitarian issues and health crises. But what I realized is that they're all more connected than ever.
Okay, yeah, we like to explore interdisciplinarity on the show quite a bit. So do you want to speak to that link at all, or how any of the topics that you've tackled in your career sort of weave together?
Sure. I mean, for me, I used to see my world and my work as pretty divided. Like, here's Carol doing this one thing, and now I'm like doing another, like secret agent. And it was really in talking with a colleague in the kind of mid-late 2000s. We were working deeply on HIV in South Africa, and we were really fighting for antiretrovirals and access for people to antiretrovirals and all of that wonderful, important activism. And then I was also working on Antarctica. I was looking at what was happening with plastics and microplastics and the Antarctic Treaty and how this place, this continent at the bottom of the world is so important for all of humanity, even though, what is the saying? It's the most beautiful place you will never visit. So I was doing this Antarctic work and, kind of early climate change work and microplastics and plastics and environmental pollution work, and then working with Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, and then this other organization, Dignitas, on HIV in Malawi. And I realized they might seem so distinct, but you have history, colonization, peoples, science, evidence, diplomacy, activism, unusual partners in crime, in making the world a better place.
Okay, I'm hearing that you've covered quite a lot of topics from quite a lot of places throughout your career, and we're going to continue to hear how they are all connected. But there are 2 projects that I want to talk about with you today. One question I often ask at the top of the show is, have you been to Antarctica? And I think we can just jump right into it because the first project was the Antarctic Cleanup Project. Maybe you can give us the who, what, when, where, and why about that?
Yeah. It's such a delight to talk about it. Thank you. The true genesis story was I was working with this organization. I was quite young, and it was an organization that was doing kind of early ecotourism and travel. And the owner, Sam Blythe, said to me, I want you to start a foundation that does kind of young people. This was early kind of volunteerism with an environmental, community service angle. And I was like, great, but I actually really want to go to Antarctica. I just had this huge desire to go to Antarctica. And maybe it's because I grew up in the North and I thought I was at the North Pole, but I wasn't. But I've just been interested in polar regions and snow and its importance, but also just a kind of a, visceral feeling. Anyway, so I started with this organization, the View Foundation, Volunteer International Environmental Work Projects, to do these projects with young people, older people, and Antarctica had to be on the radar. I wanted to go to Antarctica, but not just as a tourist. And really, it's a place of science, humanity, and not for kind of making territorial claims or dumping garbage. So long story short, the opportunity came up because a friend, Pat Shaw, who also worked for the company, said, there's a lot of garbage there. The Antarctic protocols of the Antarctic Treaty is coming into place. This place that we've committed to peace and science. The scientists and early tourism, unfortunately, are not picking up their garbage. Wasn't a huge criticism, but just an acknowledgement that we used to think of the ocean, not we, but, humanity, and not all of humanity, some more than others, as this garbage can. And maybe Antarctica is a garbage can too, because, it's so far away, it doesn't matter. So he said, why don't we do this small initiative where we bring volunteers who are going to see Antarctica anyways, who are committed to go and see Antarctica, have the means, make it a little more cheap or more accessible price-wise, go at the end of the season and literally bring back garbage. So it was as much of an awareness raiser as it was a cleanup. But we called it Cleanup Project Antarctica, and we needed a partner. And this was back in 1994. And I kind of naively but earnestly wrote to research stations. Hello, I'm Carol Devine. I run a small foundation in Canada. Can we come and help clean up your base and learn with you? It wasn't like a tisk. It was how can we work with you to implement the environmental protocol and, literally help you clean up? And, wrote to the Australians and the Brits and the Poles. And I mentioned the Polish research station. The Polish Academy of Sciences wrote us back and said, sure, come. It was very generous and very thoughtful. So we went for a first season and we had geography teachers and, people who may not normally have gone to Antarctica. And we were really lucky because how are we going to get people to go pay a considerable amount of money, go and see Antarctica, but also literally physically pick up garbage? And people did. And we were really lucky because it was the time of the fax. And we faxed press releases like, come and help us clean up Antarctica. And it got in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Canadian newspapers, and people signed up. And then the bigger project that was at the Russian research station with the Russian Antarctic expedition was, a more serious 3-month project. And with my colleagues, Wendy Trussler, who was the cook and resident artist, and Lena Nikolaeva, who was our Russian liaison officer, we literally led teams of volunteers to pick up garbage. And then it went back to Argentina, some of it back to Poland. But that's another part of the story. There's no morally superior place for garbage.
Sure. And I think probably the impact of that, obviously there was an impact in Antarctica, but then people take it back home with them, right? And they're probably more conscious about their own plastic use and, talk to people as well.
Exactly. And that's what people said to us that, yeah.
You mentioned how this project could help stations meet their obligations towards the environmental protocol of the Antarctic Treaty. Can you maybe tell us what that protocol is and how this project relates to it?
Yeah, so, they're really kind of amazing and there's a lot of intrigue behind it. But the 1959 Antarctic Treaty that said this continent is important for all of humanity. And that was a really important recognition by the first 12 signatories, but also, the other countries who saw it as a kind of like it was about to go into a place to chop up for resources, geopolitical, this is our section, this is our section. And it was a great moment to say, and it was related to this International Geophysical Year where scientists from all countries work together to understand our planet. But just to say that the environmental protocol, so you're asking about the stations and how this project related. Well, stations have to report. So the environmental protocol, which came out later, I think in the late 80s, but was implemented in the 90s when we did our project, stations have to be accountable. Once you make a treaty and once you make a protocol, you have to be accountable to it. So I know that our project, both with the Polish Academy of Sciences and the Russian Antarctic expedition, got reported at these meetings, these IATO, these Antarctic Treaty meetings. And so it was just modeling and hoping to get the word out. It was an extremely minute project in the scale of things. And we know a lot more now than we did in the mid-90s about plastics and garbage. But I think we just helped to model that collaboratively citizens who are not scientists can even support, know about it, and urge stations to fulfill their commitments.
Yeah, okay, I love it. It's accountability, it's outreach, it's education, it's activism, awareness, and action all in one. And I really like that you were able to support them in that way. You also co-authored a book about this experience, which I would like to hear a little bit about. And I'm also curious about how the title came to be. It's called The Antarctic Book of Cooking and Cleaning. I think the cleaning part is clear thus far in this conversation, but how did you come up with that title?
Yeah, I mean, when you ask that question, I think back, okay, it wasn't like a super clear line how it came about, but we really wanted to understand the polar genre. When I say we, I say my co-writer, Wendy Trussler, who was the cook for the Russians. The one thing the Russians told us when they agreed that we could come on at their station and work with them to remove some garbage and survey it, they said, you have to bring your own cook. And, food is so incredibly important because also part of the Antarctic Treaty, you can't eat the fish, you can't eat the seals. There's not a lot there. You have to bring your own food. So the cleaning part came with Wendy bringing our resident, very talented and resourceful chef, and also very collaborative. So there was this polar genre, and we were thinking of our book title, looking at like the Polar Journal. And then the polar writings at the times were wonderful. Like some of the newspapers that came out of these like sunless, freezing cold, darkest, bleakest place on Earth. And there were these journals with recipes and people's stories and little science pieces and drawings and art. Doctor artists went to Antarctica on these early expeditions. So we wanted the name and the book itself to echo this wonderful genre, if you can say, about Antarctica, which is really hybrid art, science, politics, love, etc. So we wanted to reflect too that Wendy also was such a critical part, and the food was such a critical part of the expedition because we borrowed food from the Russians. We traded things. Wendy also made a real effort to go and visit the Chilean research station. Like Antarctica is your audience and is so Antarctic, knowledgeable. But for those who don't, I mean, you have a Chilean station next door to a Russian station, and there's a 1 hour time difference, and they're 2 minutes apart. And you have down the kind of island, you've got, the Chinese base. So Wendy really made an effort to go and collect recipes and to do cooking lessons and to break bread and share food. She had this famous bread. But just to say, we wanted the book to reflect, be playful, be a bit didactic, and be a bit mysterious, but also, draw people in.
Yeah, and I think as you were speaking, we're also getting a recurrence of this theme of interdisciplinarity on how the book involves all those different aspects of the science and the history and the culture all in that one continent. We're going to shift gears a little bit into the second project that we're going to talk about today. You also worked on something called Mapping Antarctic Women. Before we get into it, maybe can you quickly discuss what we know about the role of women on the continent, or the role of women not on the continent, rather, because I understand there's a history of exclusion for women, and at one point they were even not allowed to go. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about that, or sort of set the stage for your project?
Yeah. I mean, Antarctica really started, like, who knows really when Antarctica was first discovered or seen. We know that in ancient times it was imagined, which is fascinating that humans can imagine like a polar north and south. But anyway, to say about women, we know that on some of the more famous, like the Shackleton expeditions in the early 1900s, that women applied. I actually went to the Scott Polar Research Archives and, touched the letters of the women saying, we'd like to go to Antarctica and we will don masculine attire, like we want to go. And also you have serious stories like Dr. Lois Brown, who was one of the first women with a group to overwinter in Antarctica, not till the 60s. She had scientists, women were banned. The U.S. kind of commanders, it was military run. Now it's more like science-based government run, but said there's no place in Antarctica. There's no toilets in Antarctica for women. There's no place for women in Antarctica. And there was no real good reason. And you had geologists bringing home rocks for Lois Jones and her team because they weren't allowed to go. And these male scientists were actually great because they advocated that women could go themselves. these are fantastic scientists. So, the heroes are the women and the men and whatever, gender you identify by. But just to say that the fact that women were excluded is not cool. So some of the efforts that, this Mapping Antarctic Women project that I started, and even recognizing when Wendy and Lena and I were there in the 1990s, some of the stations still didn't have women yet. And yet we were 3 women leading the expedition. We didn't pay too much attention to it. Definitely there was sexism, sexual abuse, exclusion, but also I think, there's still problems today, but it's incredible and really fantastic and to be celebrated, the amazing work of women scientists leading the bases, making massive discoveries, and being logistics crew. But I also wonder, we have this obsession with firsts, and but I wonder if some of the first women in Antarctica were not Indigenous women from the South Pacific with some of those records, or women from Chile or Argentina, like kind of geographically close. So I'm curious about those untold and unknown stories because I believe they're out there.
I'm curious then. I guess it seems like the restrictions on women participation would have been in the context of specific expeditions or specific countries. I'm wondering, is there a date at which or a moment at which inclusion was more accepted or allowed, or did it sort of happen incrementally with specific expeditions and specific countries?
Yeah, great question, Clark. There was no specific place in time, but the first known woman or documented, and I'm sure we'll discover earlier ones, was Carol Mickelson in 1935, who went with, shipping. Whaling was huge. So she saw Antarctica and wrote about it, and I think her journals are partly lost. But, back in 1935, she was a shipping magnate's wife, and whaling was, in fact, decimating and tragically, really harming the whale population back then. But then in, a few years later, Ingrid Christensen, another kind of wife, went. But it doesn't mean they don't have agency. It doesn't mean that they weren't intrepid and chose to go to this place and, weren't extremely, extremely amazing people. And then I think it started in the 50s and 60s, like South Africa, the Brits, the Germans. It really didn't start to become more equitable, I would say, till about the 80s, 90s. And then you still have countries sending their first, female expeditioners, scientists, doctors, logisticians, till later, because you also have India, Korea, China. It's a really fascinating place. But I think they're saying now more than a third of women working at research stations, more than a third of workers at research stations are women.
Well, that's a great trend. And talking to more and more people in this space, I do hear somewhat consistently that there is still a long way to go. But I also hear that the atmosphere is starting to change. But now to talk about the project itself, the project of Mapping Antarctic Women, can you give us sort of the elevator pitch for this project too?
Yeah. I mean, I really love maps. And I was sitting at the research station, and the Russians were our hosts, and they were really wonderful and so generous and so experienced. And the base commander was named Sergei, and I was in his office, and he was like saying, you be a bit careful on the glacier. I know you're from Canada, but be careful. And, there's not a lot of women have not been here. And behind him is this map, and it says Marguerite Bay. And I was just kind of zooming in and out, and I was like, yeah, women have not been in Antarctica, but actually they're all over the map. I think if, I haven't studied it like super professionally or formally, but I think if you look at cartography, it's got to be a continent with such a high number of female place names. So it came about very organically, kind of with an observation and a joke. And then when I got home, I'm like, I need to find out who was Marguerite. And she was the second wife of Charcot, a French explorer. And it was the story of women left behind, some of the early mapping. And some of it were loving tributes, or even the name of I also heard like rumors like, oh, that was Shackleton's, the named after his, lover or whatever. Like in my map, which is only a tiny fraction, that map that's out there published and designed beautifully by Aidan Meagan and through an article in Ernest Journal, a UK journal, it was a tiny percentage of the female place names that I've mapped and that people have contributed. So it's been kind of a crowd mapping. But the idea is to celebrate the women. So back to you have, Adeliland is like French named after, French explorers' children, or I forget exactly Adeliland, but you've also got Queen Elizabeth Land. So it was named after sponsors. You've got Queen Maud Land named after Norwegian queen. So sponsors, queens, mothers, nannies, children, daughters. But then what became interesting to me was when they was named after living, breathing, incredible women like Edna Plumstead, who was a botanist from South Africa, who actually in 1952, through her observations of fossils, started to put together that Gondwanaland was one land. And so some of the place names, particularly in the Transantarctic Mountains, are named after, some of them are still living, and the place names are still being made for Bulgarian, for South American, for American, for British, etc., Japanese researchers, and place names. And then some of them are named after women, like because of the features. And then some of them that on my map, like the office girls, are just kind of a play at the kind of sexism, like, thank you to the office girls who made it possible for us men to go and study for humanity. So it's meant to be playful, but it's also been such an incredible experience to have people from around the world. And I go to different Antarctic scientific conference meetings and do some kind of crowd mapping. And people are really proud and excited. And some of the women in the room I didn't know are on the map for their science. So that's been cool. And I've, run into women in the most unsuspected places and realize, oh, I have to map you. You're incredible.
Wow. And I'll just say, too, I imagine listeners might be really interested to see this map themselves, so it's linked in the show notes. But basically, to summarize, you've taken a blank map of Antarctica and you've pinned all the places on the continent that were named after women.
Yes, that's accurate. And just to add that, there's a very formal process of place naming, and there's a few, processes like other kind of geographic place names. But I want to go a bit beyond the formality. I'll also include names that have been renamed. Eva Peron Bay was renamed Mobile Oil Bay. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want to name it after the oil company. I want to keep that name. So I've gone through different online searchable, but there's no women. You have to search kind of in an unusual way. So I've done both like formal searches on databases of Antarctic place names, and then I've crowdsourced. I've asked people to send me, and I've used ribbons. Like we're at an Antarctic conference in Malaysia, of all places. People went up and mapped. It was really fun.
Okay, and then I think I got the answer to this question, but I was going to ask you if there were any sort of general statements we could make about the women. For example, are they mostly scientists? Did they all make some sort of contribution or discovery? But you mentioned that they could be sponsors, they could be scientists, but they could also be sort of children, nannies, wives, just kind of a mixed bag. Is that the best way to think of it?
Yeah, and I think the map reflects history. It reflects geopolitics. It reflects, equity and struggles for, equality. And it reflects, the geopolitics of Antarctica. It's really meant to be international. Anything related to a place name, even formal or informal, that has to do with women and women's contributions. And of course, our understanding of gender is much better understood now that it's not so, binary. But I think that, it really is a tribute to the women who fought to get there and the women who were left behind.
Have you been to any of the places that you pinned on the map?
Yes, I've been into some general areas named after women, like bays, but I've only been on the peninsula and close to the main continent. But I was thinking earlier about the first American woman to overwinter in Antarctica was, a writer. She went on a private expedition, Edith Roney. But there's a whole Roney land that's an important ice shelf, and so it's also the story of climate change and human-driven catastrophic climate change. But I'd like to go to some of the place names. Like I haven't been to East Antarctica, where there's so many female place names, or the Transantarctic Mountains, where I find it's particularly contemporary women. So maybe that was explored later. It's also the story of what was explored first has a lot of older colonial names. What was explored in the center is more recent.
Did taking on this project make you sort of ponder the significance of naming a place after a person? Do you have any reflections about that?
Yeah, I love that question. And I think, we've all seen, like recently, just yesterday, I got a message that my cousins and aunt named a bench on a golf course after my uncle, like a tribute, And I think it's a very human, it's practical too. We have to name streets, we have to name buildings. Sometimes there's financial connection, like that's my legacy, name it after me. Sometimes it's in honor of. So, place names are really, really important, but they're also very political, right? I remember being in the Soviet Union at the time where the maps consciously were made incorrectly and had wrong names, apparently. But I think it's really like what you were saying. It's really a tribute. And, there's all the names on that one map. Like at some time I'd like to, finish the digital map with like the over 400, 500 place names that I've collected and others have shared with me. But I think that it's so important to remember and honor and learn and laugh, but also think about who's not on the map.
Sure. And as we've been talking throughout this conversation, I was thinking, about people who are or are not on the map, contributions that have or haven't been recognized. I've spoken with a couple of scientists, for example, making this podcast. And, I asked the question at the beginning, have you been to Antarctica? And some tell me, no, my work is in data analysis. I have colleagues that send me the data that they've collected, but they still, are making large contributions. So yeah, I just want to give out a shout out to anyone who's making contributions to this continent who might not have the opportunity to have their name pinned to any specific place, location on the continent, but maybe their names do show up on all sorts of publications and research and different projects.
100%. I mean, I really agree with you. And Maria Klenova, who was on the map, she never touched Antarctica, but she helped map the first Soviet Antarctic Atlas. But I really hear you about the unseen but incredibly valuable women and men who are doing, Antarctic, really contributing to our understanding of Antarctica and thus the world and thus ourselves, who aren't on the map. But I would say too that there is possibility and there will be place names of people who contributed who aren't there. But I agree with your point overall. Yeah.
I'm wondering, who are your female Antarctic heroes and where do they fall on the map?
A couple of my heroes are on the map, like Edna Plumstead, who I mentioned, who did such incredibly important understanding of how our world and continents came together and apart, and just our understanding. There's so many other. Christy Brown was a 28-year-old marine biologist, British, with the British Antarctic Survey, who drowned while going to check some, research about ice shelves. She was drowned by a leopard seal. And after 30 years of, the Brits diving in Antarctica to, do their research, no one had been injured. But, that's one of the sadder memorials. But, she's my hero. What would she have done? She was only 28, but died in, happens, but very tragic. And two women I would like to see on the map. And since you asking me to do this podcast, I was like, actually, can I recommend? How do I lobby? I do advocacy work. So two women I would love to see on the map are women I had the fortune to go to Antarctica with. A couple, before COVID, is Dr. M. Jackson and Dr. Erin Pettit. They're both glaciologists, and they're both doing incredibly important work in their own right. And I believe should have place names. But also, and I'm not going to pronounce her name right, but Stephanie Chrysiwanos is an incredible writer and thinker, and she worked as a logistician for 7 years. So not, a really celebrated scientist, but she is an incredible writer and thinker and is celebrated and has some books and articles about Antarctica. But people who contribute also to the humanities, like Erin was doing really important research, or is doing really important research on the glacier melt on the Thwaites Glacier, so we can understand sea level rise. And Erin wrote a book, and M wrote a book called The Secret Life of Glaciers, and really has been looking at glaciers from a social science, but also, deeply important kind of environmental nature, climate beingness of, glaciers. I think they should have place names. But then also Stephanie, who I mentioned, who's looking at the humanities and really is looking at the colonial history, but in a very fresh and important new way as a woman of color.
Yeah, it seems like this map is living and breathing, because it seems like there will still be lots of discoveries and stories that are made both scientifically and geographically. And I'm hoping that this map will continue to evolve and more names just get added to it. We are going to round out to the last couple of questions, and I want to ask you if you have any final comments about either of the projects that we've talked about today or your research and work in Antarctica in general.
Yeah. I think what connects the projects and what drives me and what I've had such a great and continue to have such a great fortune to work with the so-called Antarctic community, the polar community, but it's also a community who cares about collaboration and interdisciplinarity and not living with the status quo, changing the status quo for the better. The projects all talk about celebrating science and art and each other and the international nature of this work, but also the inequities that are inherent, whether it's, migrants or people who are so affected by pollution and climate change and don't have access to medicines or early warning for, extreme weather events. And Antarctica is so incredibly important, as is the Arctic, as is the Amazon rainforest, as are all rivers. I think that just Antarctica, for me, what I love about it and what I recognize, I have such a privilege to have gone there, and I probably don't need to go again, is that, it's an example of humans getting together and saying, we could really spend so much money and I think it's going to probably happen, and we have to really fight against it, get all of the minerals out of this continent. Sure, I can't disagree that we need, items to live with, and medicines come from oceans, and the cars we drive, the computers that we're speaking on. But I don't know, the project's linked to me a love of Antarctica, but it's really about equity, joy, collaboration, and what a group of humans can do together and learn and make mistakes. But I really feel so privileged I got to go to Antarctica, to this other world, which is really so important for all of us.
I could not have thought of a better note to end on. The last question I have for you is, where can people find you and follow your work?
Yeah, so Instagram at Antarctic Cook and Clean. Antarctic without an A, not Antarctica. So Instagram, Antarctic Cook and Clean. X, which I'm feeling a bit mixed about. Twitter, I'll call it. It's at ABCC Antarctica. But you can also find me on caroldevine.org, caroldevine.org. And Wendy and our book asked bookstores for it because it was a very special print run, it's now only available digitally. We love books. So the Antarctic Book and Cooking and Cleaning, look out for it and ask your bookstore or HarperCollins for it.
Okay, perfect. Links to all of those will be included in the episode description, as well as to the projects that we talked about today. And this is the part where I want to say thank you so much for coming on the show today. Thank you for sharing your work with us, and also for the really important activism and research you've done in this space.
Thank you so much, Clark. And I can't wait to hear some other of the podcast. Bye now.
All right, another final thank you to Carol Devine, and a big, big thank you to every guest that we've had on the show in season 2. And also a major thank you to you listeners for sticking with us. This has been the season finale of South Pole, and we will see you right back here very shortly with season 3. So stay tuned and stay subscribed. You've been listening to South Pole. You can find more information about this week's guests and links to their work in the episode description. Cover art for the show was done by Laurel Wong, and the music you're listening to was done by Neela Ruiz. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and this episode was produced and engineered by me. And if you found it interesting, send it to someone you know. South Pole is part of a larger network of sciencey podcasts called Pine Forest Media. We've got one on plastic, one on drinking water, and a couple new ones coming out soon. You can find more information about us in the episode description as well, or on our website at Pine Forest Pods. We're also on Instagram and TikTok at Pine Forest Media, and if you love the show and want to support science communication like this, a 5-star rating across platforms and a review on Apple Podcasts is one of the best things you can do to help this science reach more people and for the entire network to grow. All right, thank you to all of you who have made it this far, and we'll talk soon.